Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. I'm Gary Polland. This week's co-host is Dallas Jones. Welcome back, Dallas.
Always great to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Our topic this week is Houston's growth, challenges, and opportunities. And we have two interesting guests who are going to help discuss this important issue that we all face. First, Chris Brown, who's Houston Controller. Welcome back, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
And a first-time guest, Dr. Bruce Race, who's a professor at our University of Houston. Welcome, Dr. Race.
Thank you.
So, for the first question, what are the challenges we face with growth? And I'm going to ask you, Dr. Race, first.
Well, there's going to be 2 million people moving into Harris County, by 2045, and that's a lot of folks. And where are you going to put them, and how are you going to accommodate them? And we start looking at our infrastructure. No one here complains about traffic, right? So that's a lot. That's a lot more drivers, perhaps, and so we have to think about how you accommodate that in the long term. And what can we do as a city? Because we're an unusual city, because we're very open about land use decisions. And we have a lot invested in light rail. We have over $1.3 billion in light rail without a land use plan. So we have it's really going to be uphill for us as a city without a plan. So how are we going to address that? Now, I could imagine half of those folks take 1 million people and put them in 60 or 70 blocks in Houston. That would be transformative for over a dozen intersections. You provide all this multifamily housing, more choices for the type of economy that we're looking at in the future, and more transit oriented. We can drop that on top of our transit investment, and that'll take a lot of pressure off both our roads from a driving perspective, and also in terms of our air quality and our other infrastructure, because we can start building it on top of infrastructure we already have invested in. We're not building a lot more roads on the edges.
So I have to give a disclaimer, which is that my firm represents Metro, and you talk about light rail, but the fact of the matter is it's not being used. So how do we...
Yeah, we have ghost trains.
I didn't say that. How do we get people utilizing the system we have while incorporating things? Houston currently lacks the idea of micromobility. When we move into other places and people are using scooters to get to trains and
the
these
last
things,
mile solution.
How do we get to that place where it's not about what we have, but it's about the utilization of what we have?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent way to frame it. If you take the long view, early you can look at optimization through management and ops, and apps, and so you look at how you operate stuff, and there's new applications to help you personalize your transit trip, for example, making it much more seamless. The second middle ground type of investment can be layered infrastructure. Start dropping electric charging and nodal infrastructure, so you start to be much more deliberate about where you focus your sidewalks, for example. You got to be able to walk if you're taking the train. And in the long term, you can start looking at, fancier
and that's
or
one
embedded
of the concerns. We don't
infrastructure.
have the infrastructure to accommodate certain types of transit. Are these things the same, or do we get there singularly?
Well, they have to be connected. That's the whole idea. The best way to get ridership in a transit corridor is to build housing on it.
Yeah, what you mentioned, and it's interesting, if you look at the development, at least the train downtown, going into Midtown, there's apartment projects going up like the whole length of it. So in that aspect, are we saying that the Metro has had a positive effect in terms of housing density in that respect?
Well, it's a market response. People don't want to sit in traffic, right? And so you look at, we've gone from a hub spoke city to a polycentric.
Explain that to
So
viewers.
we had a downtown and all the transit went there. It's like a bicycle wheel, right? And so what's happened over time, we've become a polycentric or multi-centered city. So like a couple of years ago, we took our bus system we turned it into a grid, a big regional grid to connect those instead of everything running through downtown.
I'm going to try that again. You're a policy wonk. Explain that to our viewers so they understand what you mean, in the sense that We're polycentric. Everything you're saying.
Yeah,
Explain it to them in layman's terms.
as a region, so we have the Med Center,
Right.
the largest medical complex in the U.S. We start to look at our other business centers that are at our freeway intersections. So many cities, they just have one downtown. We have a half a dozen. And that's part of our pattern as we grow. So connecting those together with transit is important, particularly when you start to think about if you can connect these employment centers together and you can build housing in those routes, that's how we get more cars off the road and improve our air quality.
So let's ask Chris. So Chris, you've heard the professor's discussion about increasing density being better down, I guess, for Houston's growth. 2 million people. Does the city have a plan to deal with 2 million more people?
Yep.
I can't imagine what the traffic will be like.
So there's two parts to this challenge, and first and foremost, as the controller, I think about how are we going to pay for all the infrastructure, how are we going to afford to be able to accommodate the growth of 2 million additional people in the upcoming decades. I think the other piece of it is that the investments that we're making today, we need to make sure that we do that in a manner that is most efficient. So we've talked about Metro and the Metro Next plan, which is a multimodal. It's not just rail. I think there's 20 miles of rail. It's an expansion of bus and some BRT and other things. But
What's BRT?
Bus rapid
rapid
transit,
transit.
which is similar to rail, doesn't have a fixed line, it rubber tires, less expensive, cost per mile. So, in looking at the development of the increase of Metro's plan, are we leveraging those dollars in the most efficient way? One of the things I talk about a lot, and we talked about it earlier, is first mile, last mile connectivity. Take that in the framework of where technology is going. 10 years ago, people were not hopping on scooters that they could rent from their smartphones to get to. They weren't Ubering, and that's a really big piece of it. And this is the thing I tell people, and I'm supportive of the Metro plan, but we need to be looking at not where we are today, because we're talking about investing $7 billion in an infrastructure plan. How is that going to what is Houston going to look like in 10, 15 years when autonomous vehicles come in and shared ride is dominating short-term rides?
We'll need 1/3 the freeway lanes when we automate the fleet.
Really?
Yeah. So
Well, that's good news.
We're
because
building 20 lanes. We're going to have 12 extra.
We don't have room to build the highways we're going to need with the present capacity.
But I have a question. Chris, you've done an amazing job as controller, and maybe I'm biased, but can we afford it?
It's a great question. I think we're looking at the numbers. I think a large portion of that $7 billion is coming in the form of federal grant dollars. Okay. There is going to have to be a substantial more amount of debt that's issued, and I think based on the initial evaluation we've done, they can afford it. But it's a question, and we're talking about infrastructure. We've in the past used bonds to fund all of our infrastructure projects, our water, wastewater, and have moved with rebuild into a pay-as-you-go system because people felt uncomfortable about issuing that much debt. Again, my big concern is I think, yes, we can pay for it, but what are things going to look like in 15 years? Are we going to say, God, I wish maybe we had done more of this or more of that? And we have to look, and I think to the Professor Dr. Race's comments, you have to have a comprehensive plan because you really have to know kind of where you're going as you make these investments. And it's all interconnected. I mean, when we talk about flooding and traffic and all these different things, I do think technology is going to play a big part in making transportation more efficient. Flooding is a different story.
Well, Dr. Race, this is your area of expertise, and you have colleagues. We have many great universities in the Houston region. Is there a way for you all to interact with the political figures who are going to end up making these decisions to make sure that we don't make billion-dollar mistakes and don't do the things we need to do?
Again.
And the 2 million people, again, and the 2 million, right,
Well,
because you're right.
We have a lot of colleagues who do the research and make the pitch about this. And how do you make it personal for people? Because sometimes you get lost in the data.
Exactly.
And you just really have to think about what it means to somebody who can't afford to lift their house, right? And so if you're forced to lift a house, and because of half the house value is what triggers it, and you're a poor family, you either live where it floods or you have to walk, and that's not a very equitable way to view the future either. So there's hundreds of thousands of stories like that after Hurricane Harvey, And we still, as a city, we don't, because we don't have a master plan, and we're concerned about getting the water out of the city and into the county land. The county's just trying to dig and lift like crazy because they've got, their mandate is to keep us dry, but it's just like adding another freeway lane. You still have to take the long view on this. And so how do we mitigate? How do you think like a business when you start to look at where detention comes from and how do we pay for it? How does it become part of a developer's pro forma? We look at a uniform set of policies with the city and the county in terms of how we look at land use and detention. And we don't do that. We stovepipe a lot of things in the region.
Yeah. Our job here is we're trying to inform Houstonians about these issues. My question to you, and there are hundreds of thousands of stories of what happened. I lost my home. It was $300,000 to raise it, right? The question becomes, are we doing enough? And how do you feel, or either you, Controller, about how well the county and the city is working together to actually mitigate our issues? Because the reality is, none of us want to go through this again. Your home was flooded, or close to.
Not really. We did have
your neighborhood.
a neighborhood flooded. Our neighborhood flooded. A lot of our neighbors flooded. That's right.
Right.
Yeah, but and then tied into your question, Dallas, is taking care of the people who suffered catastrophic losses with Harvey. Are we just taking care of them so the next flood is going to take them out again?
Well, every
because we
freeway
haven't
ring
done that.
floods the previous one, and that's the way we develop. And so, if you look at the mid 50s annexation ring, you look at our annexation map, you'll see. I call it the Mad Men neighborhoods flooded, right? And so they had all these neighborhoods from the 50s and 60s. The Big Fin car neighborhoods and the patio homes and Sunset Magazine, they flooded. So we work with the Mid-Braes Bayou communities last summer and assessing what happened to them, looking at detention opportunities, looking at some community revitalization strategies with them. So with aspirations, not just digging and lifting. And so partly our own economic growth will help tow us out of this, but you need to plan for it. You need to be proactive. You need to assemble partners. You have to work on both sides of the county and city line to do that. But we're still, as a region, not because we don't do comprehensive planning, we're not used to working together. And Harvey has forced that in some cases, but we were not practiced at it.
So if I can frame with what you're saying there's hope, right?
Yeah, well, if we did not learn from Harvey, we are not going to learn.
And speaking of that, Chris, what has the city of Houston learned through Harvey, at least through your good offices?
I think what we've learned is that we have probably underfunded investment in stormwater infrastructure over the years for whatever reasons, and that there are events like Harvey that are possible. I mean, people thought after Allison, well, that's a once in 100-year event. And then we had Memorial Day, Tax Day, and then we had Harvey. So, with weather patterns the way they are, we're going to see probably a lot more of this extreme weather. We didn't probably prepare the infrastructure to deal with that. Now, credit to the county and the city passing the flood bond, $2.5 billion. That'll be coupled with federal money. That's a comprehensive plan. I think that they're working together in concert. I think the question was, are the county and the city working well together? Yes, but we need to make sure that we have public policy that supports that investment. So, for example, I think we were talking about before the show, we should not be approving development for large projects in flood-prone areas, because that's essentially going to be fill, and that's just going to flood other people. So if we're spending billions of dollars to mitigate future flood damage, we shouldn't have policies that incentivize more flooding. With the light rail, for example, and the investment we made, the initial 7.5 miles there on Main Street, we really should have had, in my opinion, a transit-oriented development ordinance that relaxed parking requirements around the pedestrian shed. So where the light rails.
That's an excellent point.
You have that
visionary thinking.
Well, you have, and I can't take full credit. I'm usually sitting next to another urban planner, which my deceased father, who for many years and was a
blessing to our city.
A blessing, and he was an advocate for rail and for multimodal transit. But he said, it's a shame we spent all this money, we made this investment, And it's taken, that was in '03, that in '04, I think we finally got it in place. But, it took over a decade before we started seeing really dense development. It's happening now, but what if we had put the public policies in place in advance of passing that? Developers would have said, okay, the parking requirement is one of the biggest barriers to me doing a project. If we had reduced the parking requirement.
We are overparked.
And said we want more people walking, more people would use the light rail. They would use the bikes. I mean, bike is a technology that's been around forever. We'd have a lot more people. And just think if the developers said, okay, we got this reduction in parking requirement. Now we can give reduced rates to people. They say, well, I don't need a parking spot because I got a bike. And we're going to reduce your rent.
Uber.
Or Uber. Uber wasn't really
Uber
prolific
and
around there,
Lyft.
but cabs were back there. And
The urban developers want to rent or sell you your parking space separate.
yeah.
Right.
That's where we're going.
But we need to all have, and that's part of that comprehensive plan, is that we need to buy into it, and then we need to have public policy that supports that investment. And we need to make the right decisions because.
Go ahead, Gary.
Well, I was going to say, in line with that, I was going to ask about our permitting process. Does our permitting process in Houston now encompass the kind of themes that you and Dr. Race have been talking about?
And Dr. Race and I were talking about this beforehand. I mean, for a city that has no zoning and is laissez-faire, and I have a lot of friends of mine that are developers, I mean, they're really frustrated because it's very difficult in a city with no zoning to get projects built.
We are a highly regulated city, and we don't pride ourselves in that, but we are.
Yeah.
And we don't instead of having a policy, we patch something with a regulation, and so it's a crazy quilt when you compare it to my client cities. It's just very difficult.
Maybe you ought to
So
audit it, Chris.
case in point,
here's the
we've done
softball.
some good things to streamline permitting. Before, if you had to go down and get a wastewater permit, an electrical permit, you'd have to stand in line 3 times. Now they've streamlined that where you have multiple permits through the Houston Permitting Center. That's a step in the right direction. But why not have, and this is one of the recommendations, why not have a streamlined approval process for projects that we think fit in that framework for transit-oriented development, or projects that have outsized detention that would actually help in flooding. So these are the things about
time
having.
is money for a developer.
Yeah, right.
And so make it easier to do the right thing.
We've talked about a lot of concepts with nuances, and I think, and particularly to you, Mr. Controller, how long? I think people are trying to figure out, particularly those most affected. You hear billions, you hear millions, you hear feds, you hear TLO, you hear all these concepts. How long, really, honestly?
And for which particular, we're talking about transportation or
for
flooding?
For the people that are trying to figure out, yes, we understand and agree that we're facing these issues. How long is it going to take before Houston, the greatest city in the world, I think we all agree, how do we get back to normal?
Yeah, it's a challenge because, as we said from the beginning, the onset of the show, I mean, we're adding a lot of people. We're going to add.
We're so dynamic. We're chasing normal.
Yeah, so every time you think, hey, well, we can get our hands around flooding or we can get our hands around traffic, we're growing outward. We probably need to grow upward more because then it's a little bit easier to manage that. But the answer is, I think we're always going to be this is just an unfortunate reality. We're always going to be a little bit behind the 8 ball because as long as we keep growing and as long as we have a shortage of funds to address the issue, we're going to continue to be behind that 8 ball. So the challenge, I think, is, again, to have the policies that incentivize catching up to...
Policy innovation is something that we should
I give you this
have more
look because
discussion
I'm
on.
like, as long as we have the shortage of funding and yet we're hearing of all this funding coming in, again, when does it begin to be applicable?
So I was at the Brays Heights Civic Club last night in my neighborhood where I live, and I was happy to hear an update on Hurricane Harvey and all the wonderful work they're doing along Brays Bayou. But the thing that I was a little bit caught off guard was they said, all this work, everything we're doing is only going to get us back to
zero.
Flat. So now, there was a presentation about building a giant tunnel from 610 Loop at Braeswood out to the ship channel to channel all that additional water to get us ahead. But that would take 6 to 10 years and $2 to $3 billion. So again, it's kind of like every time we think we've solved the problem, it's like a new problem. So It's going to be an ongoing challenge. I think we're heading in the right direction. We're absolutely doing some out-of-the-box steps. I have to give credit to the mayor in revising the floodplain ordinance to allow for new properties, for the most part, that have to be elevated above the 500-year floodplain. So that helps, and that's one of those policy things that I think is in line with what we're trying to do. But we need more money, and we need more of that type of thinking.
And you know what, Gary? I think that's why this conversation is important, because people really just don't know.
No, there's no information out there. You talked about the costs in relationship. You talked about costs. Maybe there needs to be put into the process the developers get to pay the impact that their development's going to have on the floodplain and any other externalities that may occur. So realistically,
I am shocked that's coming from you, Gary.
Well, and not only am I shocked that it's coming from Gary, I'm looking at him like, really, Gary?
no, but-
That's how you feel?
well, because otherwise, what you're doing is you're subsidizing.
that's
You're subsidizing that
is
development.
common. That's very
I
common
want the public
practice.
to
and mo- and
recognize
most-
Gary said
and-
tax business.
and most places, that's common practice. And so
Developers do pay an impact fee. Those fees have continued to rise, but on-site detention seems to be a kind of subjective requirement, and that in itself is a tax. If you have a parcel of land and you can't develop a portion of it because you have to have detention, you're losing money. And so, you just have to continue to look at uniform regulation.
Just so when you sell, so you're selling you buy a business development, you're selling a house, it needs to show all the costs that you're actually incurring, and it not shoved onto the city or the county or onto everybody else when we flood because of that development. So that's something that could be
so
done
what
so
about-
people know realistically what they're doing.
What about in the transportation frame? Because this is a discussion that's been percolating around City Hall. What about all the people that live outside of the city, out in the county, but yet they work downtown? They drive on city roads. They, use a internal combustion engine, ICE engine, so they're polluting. They're doing all these things using the infrastructure, but they're not paying anything. So, this is the same kind of discussion.
what
as,
part
Are you
of
saying
it
that
is a
everybody
regional
that
question?
drives to work,
Commuter
they're-
tax.
Well,
they're
this is kind of the
they're
same thing
polluting.
that Gary's talking about, which I'm surprised he's talking about. So.
Well, you want costs to be realistic. You don't want the cost shoved onto the public,
Right.
and you don't want to really subsidize anything.
And
But
those
the truth of the matter is, and these debates have come out about a number of things. You want an amazing city. You live in an amazing city. How far are you willing to go to pay for it?
that it's a qualitative question. We're going to grow. We always have grown. It's a qualitative question, and that's if you think about cities that people get on planes to go visit, they're 20 times our density. So it's not a quantitative question. It's a qualitative question, and that's part of the challenge for us to think about. We don't invest in the public domain the same way. Mm-hmm. One of the things we were talking about earlier is that we spend on our budget, our city budget, $7 million per square mile of Houston. LA spends $20 million per square mile in their city budget. New York City spends $304 million per square mile. Okay, and so that's an investment. Now we have our own realities, and I'm impressed by Houston, our ability as a city to fund what we do and how we do it, because we're stretched. We are stretched.
We're such a large city, and we're not a dense city, 650 square miles. So service delivery, and I know this as the controller and looking at all the metrics, it's just more expensive for us to run water lines, sewer lines. We just have more. It's harder for police and fire to patrol a larger area. The cost of service delivery is a lot higher. So
And with less budget.
The key is density, though. I think, and as we continue to grow and add these people, instead of maybe continuing to push the boundaries, is to try and somehow incentivize more folks to live inside the city, because then, again, you're not policing as far for new residents, and maybe you can tap into existing infrastructure and things like that.
You spark a different question in my mind. Mm-hmm. Given all that, what role does Prop B play in all this?
What's Prop B? No, I'm kidding. That's been the topic du jour at City Hall, so I had to throw a joke in there. For the viewers that don't follow, that's the firefighter pay parity.
Right, absolutely. So the question is, when you talk about the need for these things, what we're seeing is a space, a place where we're contemplating the notion that we'll lose services. will lay off employees. Rumor has it, firefighters first. What role will that play in our growth?
Well, I think it's very similar to what we had with the pension challenge. We had a problem with pension benefits that were rising, and they were rising at a rate that was, unsustainable. It was eating into the core services and the money that we were using for infrastructure. And we had to work out a negotiated solution with the pensions to cap those costs. And then we finally can now put money aside for infrastructure and other things. I think the same solution is for Prop B. We have to get a mutually negotiated multi-year phase-in. We can afford, hopefully, that over time, because otherwise, if we get hit with a lump sum, let's say it's a $100 million payment next year, fiscal year 2020, that starts July 1st, that's $100 million that we're not going to be able to spend on all the things we're talking about here today. So.
Well, and to be fair to the firemen, there was opportunity to get a deal done earlier, but the mayor was not interested.
I think there's still
At least
opportunity.
that's their side.
I think there's still opportunity. I'm an optimist.
But I will also say this that we've discussed, and we're down to our last 30 seconds, that the city needs to take a hard look, and I've said this to you before, Chris, at the services it provides. It needs to establish priorities. Because if you look at the budget, there are areas to scrub. There are areas that are not priorities. We have things that are not being funded. Part of the problem is we're under-policed. Our fire department needs to be totally reorganized given the 21st century we live in. There's no reason for engines to follow ambulances all over the city. It's ridiculous. So that's it. I mean, Dallas, thanks for coming, brother.
Always fun to be here.
Chris Brown, always a pleasure. You were very interesting. And Dr. Race, you were great. I'm going to have you back.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week with another exciting show on Red, White, and Blue.